welcome to Buckeyes Tomorrow Morning for Friday, February 17th. I'm your host, Tom Orr. The Indiana game is in 197 days, the game against Michigan in 281 days. Today we are going to be taking a look at one of my absolute favorite features all year long. It is Alex Gleitman's behind-the-scenes look at the previous year's Ohio State recruiting class. I am far from alone on that front. This is something that gets incredible feedback every year. We've been on multiple sites together in the past. He's been on other sites with even before he and I worked together, and it is always one of the most popular features every year. Alex joins me now to take a look out at the offensive side of the ball. He's already posted the offensive side of the ball, defensive side of the ball, still to come at BuckeyeHuddle.com. As always, we are talking about a very small percentage of what he has actually written about. You got to go to BuckeyeHuddle.com, sign up to be a member to get the full story. So what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at each of the position groups on offense, and we're just going to take a look at one of the guys, the story behind the story of one of the guys in the recruiting class. And Alex, let's start with the quarterback. Ohio State had a quarterback committed in Brock Glenn. They had a whole mess of other quarterbacks in at various points. Lots of guys who looked like maybe, possibly, and then weren't. So we'll leave all those guys. All that can be on the huddle board at BuckeyeHuddle.com. People can find out about all of that. But the quarterback that Ohio State ended up signing, Lincoln Kienholz, not exactly a pipeline school or a pipeline state. They had to go to South Dakota to find him, but what was the story behind Ohio State going to South Dakota to find its quarterback in the 2023 recruiting class?
Yeah, I mean, that was an interesting one because Ohio State finally thought that they had their guy in Brock Glenn over the summer. And I think, the great thing about Ohio State, many schools would just, that's it. We're done. We're not even going to look anymore. But Ohio State, until a kid's signed, just like a kid can flip from Ohio State can make their own decisions and move on from a kid if it's not what they think the kid is when they originally take his commitment, or potentially if they find someone that maybe fits what they're looking for a little bit better. And I think the great thing about Mark Pantoni and his staff, they're constantly evaluating not only uncommitted prospects, committed prospects elsewhere, but committed prospects to Ohio State to make sure that the guys that they thought they were getting were the ones that they're getting. And I don't think there was anything Brock Glenn did wrong, but when they continued to look at a guy like Lincoln Kienholz and he just popped on film to them, and probably at first you're like, okay, he plays in South Dakota. I'm a little worried about the competition, but you watch him more and more. Okay, we're going to watch him during his senior season. The tape looks great. Let's go out and see him live. And they sent Corey Dennis in the middle of the season. I think it might have been during the bye week, or just like middle of the week, just on send him on the private jet up and back to South Dakota to go see him play. And from everything I heard, Corey Dennis just fell in love with this kid. And they tried to kind of keep it under wraps a little bit, but obviously when people show up in Ohio State gear at a game like that, the kid was committed to Washington at the time. It's gonna make a little chatter, but I still think people they didn't realize exactly how much Ohio State was interested. You started to hear some things about Brock Glenn. I did, at least. I looked into them. Seems like they were true, that he was maybe going to flip to Florida State. I looked into it, and a good source wouldn't tell me who at the time, but basically that Ohio State had their eye on someone else, and it was Lincoln Kienholz. And I don't think they would have made the move to kind of mutually part ways with Brock Glenn had they not felt pretty good about their chances with Lincoln. But they kind of took a little bit of a risk because the Washington head coach, where he was committed, grew up in South Dakota, was friends with his father, and obviously the path to the field at Washington is going to be a little bit easier than it is at Ohio State. And even out of Lincoln's own mouth, the NIL package he was kind of being put in front of him was better at Washington. So it was I don't want to call it an uphill battle, but it was a little bit of a gamble and a risk by Ohio State, but obviously it paid off. And they got a kid who, people compare him just because he plays football, basketball, baseball. He's super athletic. He's just got that kind of it factor. They compare him a little bit to Joe Burrow, who's very similar. And honestly, I think that's a great comparison. You watch the kid play, that's the style. I mean, to be the number one pick in the draft and win the Heisman and go to a Super Bowl, that's a tall order to put on a 17-year-old kid or whatever he is. But, I personally think that the style of player and the type of kid that you're getting is very similar to what Ohio State got in Joe Burrow back in, 2015 or something like that. So great get for Ohio State.
Yeah, and this is, the third or fourth class in a row where Ohio State, at least one of their quarterbacks, has been someone who is not even remotely on the radar during the summer or maybe even the start of the fall. And, you never know who you're going to get, and then all of a sudden they pick up someone very late in the class. It worked out just fine with C.J. Stroud. It has worked out pretty well so far, at least with Devin Brown. Kyle McCord was in there a little earlier. Jack Miller was in there a little earlier, but yeah, it has been a little bit dramatic with Ohio State's quarterback play, but it has worked out okay. I am still enjoying the thought of Corey Dennis, like, I'll just hop on the PJ, go up to South Dakota in my Ohio State gear. I'm sure no one will notice. Yeah, that is probably a tough place to slide in surreptitiously through the side door and not get noticed that Ohio State's there. I wonder who they're here scouting here in South Dakota. Could be anyone. I don't know. Let's go very far from South Dakota down to South Florida. Let's talk running backs. And Ohio State did not sign a running back in the 2023 class. That's real weird. That is very unusual, and there was plenty of drama there as well. And we're gonna pick up what is going to become a familiar theme on this show, I think, a little bit. NIL. You mentioned it earlier there with Lincoln Kienholz, and it worked out okay for Ohio State. It did not work out quite as well when it comes to running back Mark Fletcher, who was committed until he wasn't.
Yeah, this is one. If you heard Ohio State coaches and whatnot talk on National Signing Day in February, I think it was February, maybe it was the December one. I can't remember which press conference, but they ultimately were talking about how they were going to take the learnings from this year from an NIL perspective and be able to adapt better and be more prepared for them. Because I think last year you saw not just Ohio State, but many schools across the country, their eyes were opened at some of the things that happened on the recruiting trail, just the way NIL was used, or I guess misused, versus the intent of the rule, or really people just flat out kind of breaking the rules to some extent, and the NCAA not doing anything about it. But it definitely, running back was one of those positions where I think their eyes were kind of open, because they went into the cycle wanting 2 guys, ended up with 0. And Mayan Williams could have left after this year. Ravion Henderson, there was rumors about him transferring. I mean, he very well could go to the NFL after next year. You don't know if Evan Pryor's, still to this day, we don't know after spring if Evan Pryor's going to be in the room. There was rumors about, Tennessee and other programs trying to throw NIL money at Dallin Hayden. So taking 0 in this class certainly was not in the plans. I'll say that. And they had a guy committed in Mark Fletcher since I think it was January. They had him committed for a while. It became pretty clear that a lot of their top targets weren't going to end up in the class. And they ultimately they were loyal to Mark Fletcher. They could have ended up just taking a random second back if they wanted, or pursuing some other guys really, really hard. But they said, you know what? We got our guy. We feel good about keeping him. We don't need a second back. We would have loved one, but we don't really need one. And unfortunately for Ohio State, that kind of backfired on them a little bit, because they pumped the brakes on some other guys. Mark Fletcher, as we entered the fall, I think remained solid to Ohio State. But, as we got closer to signing day, I think some people in his camp started hearing things from Florida, from Miami, where he eventually signed, about the types of NIL opportunities he would have at those schools. And I think some of those people maybe drove the decision away from Ohio State. I think, what I wrote was, if it was up to the kid, if NIL wasn't a factor, I think Mark Fletcher would be at Ohio State. If it wasn't a thing. If the decision was solely up to Mark, I still think even with NIL, he would maybe be at Ohio State. But I think there's some pretty influential people in his life that were really pushing for him to pursue some of these opportunities that, look, if these kids get hurt or they don't make the NFL, this is now an opportunity for them to be able to take care of their families if they're not in the best position. So I personally can't fault someone for, if someone's going to guarantee you X amount of dollars up front and they can actually deliver on that. Jaden Rashada would like to talk to you about that. But if they can actually deliver on that, it's hard to tell a kid, you shouldn't do that, because every kid and every family is in a different position. And look, it's not like Miami's never put guys in the NFL. It's not like Florida's never put guys in the NFL. So it's not like you're going to some random small school in the middle of nowhere where you're not going to get developed for the next level. So, it was unfortunate that Ohio State was loyal to a kid for so long, and then he unfortunately kind of just flipped the script on them too late, where they couldn't really find anyone to fill his spot. But, you never know. Today, there was already murmurs of maybe Mark Fletcher is unhappy in Miami, and I think Brandon Innes tweeted a picture of the two of them and said it's never too late to Mark Fletcher. So, with a little Buckeye nut emoji. So we'll see. We'll see what happens. You never know. These kids transfer portal, no penalty to transfer. Tomorrow he can enter the portal and be at Ohio State in a month. So that would be great. That would be interesting. Full circle. But yeah, it was a crazy ride for Ohio State at running back there.
Yeah, and that is not just purely like speculation or, well, that could happen. You mentioned Jaden Rashada earlier. Jaden Rashada no longer gator chomping, now in Tempe in Arizona State Sun Devil. I'm going to guess he's not making $13 million at Arizona State, but you never know. But yes, it is the wild world of recruiting. Lots of stuff can change before they commit. Lots of stuff can change after they commit and before they sign, and lots of stuff can change after they sign. So we are definitely not at the end portion or the happily ever after portion of any of these stories yet. Next one, let's talk wide receivers. Well, this is Brian Hartline recruiting. Of course, he landed all the guys he wanted to, more or less, and there was a little drama. There was a little drama around Carnell Tate. One guy who there was maybe a little more drama than people knew, or at least a little more possibility of drama there, was Noah Rogers. He is out of North Carolina. And there was a little bit of a home state battle there, and that may have gone on maybe a little bit longer than people thought.
Yeah, well, Noah Rogers, he's from North Carolina, and I think the concern about him originally was that he was a little bit of a homebody. He's from Raleigh, North Carolina State. A lot of his friends, he had a couple friends committed there. He knows a lot of people there. He's very close with his family, and so you would never think a recruit of his caliber, like a top 50 kid, North Carolina State isn't the first school you think about. He went to UNC, you're like, okay, maybe, like they pulled some kids, and I think both of those schools were feeling like they had a really great shot. And I think it was the spring game. Noah Rogers came up and visited, had an amazing visit. I spoke to someone who spent a lot of time with him that weekend, and following that weekend, they said Noah Rogers coming to Ohio State. And he didn't announce. He waited. And it became June, and I started, you're like, okay, he's going to take a late June visit. He's going to commit, right? So I started reaching out to some people down in North Carolina who were a little bit more familiar with the situation than I was. And they kind of said to me, this was like maybe in early June, that this one may be taking a 180 a little bit. And the reason was that Ohio State at that point, I think, can't remember the exact timing, but I think it was right after they had Innis Tate, and so maybe it was like mid-June, Innis Tate and Bryson Rogers already committed. And I think some people started getting in, not Noah's head necessarily, but maybe his mom's head, about Noah kind of isn't going to be featured at Ohio State. He's not a priority. He's second fiddle. They have these three other guys, and I think it kind of got to them a little bit, and it almost to the fact where it ruined this one for Ohio State, and he was going to stay home. But, Ryan Day, Brian Hartline, they caught wind of this. They were able to do damage control, able to get on the phone with Noah's mom and Noah, make sure that they knew he was priority, that he was their priority. He went up for that late June visit. I think that's what really sealed the deal. I think it was like June 21st or something like that. They got to really kind of show him that love up close and personal. After maybe, I'm going to say they took their foot off the gas, but maybe a little bit after that spring game visit, thinking, things were all but a formality. So great save by Brian Hartline, by Ryan Day, the rest of the staff. And it was one that really almost went the other way. But Ohio State was able to save it. And, even then, it was one, even when you got his commitment, just because of how big of a homebody he was and his family and all that, you had to just watch. He took, I think, a few visits to North Carolina State. They were called visits. They were marked on his profiles and things like that on the different sites. Some of them might have just been let me go see my boys and hang out for a night. I live in Raleigh. That's going to be my social life on a Friday night. But you know what? He was hanging around football players, and that could have swayed his decision. So I think there was definitely a sigh of relief when that letter of intent came in the Woody Hayes Athletic Center.
All right, and that is a very smooth transition from a lot of visits with friends and family in one school. That is a very smooth transition to Jelani Thurman, who committed to Ohio State and then just kind of kept visiting Auburn. And yeah, he has a sister there, but they also have a football team there, and that's a pretty good football team. And it was another one where I think Ohio State was probably pretty happy to see that fax come in on early signing day.
Yeah, they that was an interesting one all the way, because they fought so hard to get that commitment. And Kevin Wilson, I remember like Jelani liked Ohio State. He liked what they had to offer. He loved the offense. He loved like kind of how they were envisioning him. He loved how they were using Cade Stover, that what they were going to tell him, telling him about using Cade Stover. And then he did like, what they did with Cade Stover this fall. But I don't think he's kind of like a different bird. I'll just say that. Like, recruits shouldn't care like about how much love fans are showing on social media and things like that. But like those were the types of things Jelani was looking at. He's like, the Michigan State fans want me and the Auburn fans want me. I'm not feeling that love from Ohio State. And I think there was a point where like Ohio State fans didn't really know he was a realistic target. And so, people started writing about it because he had visited in the summer and it was becoming a realistic possibility. And, I think he started feeling that love, and the coaches, Kevin Wilson made him a huge priority. Ryan Day made him a huge priority. And ultimately he committed, and you thought that was it and that was done. Usually when he's the son of a former really talented women's basketball player and Odell Thurman, who's an NFL linebacker. And usually those types of kids are like, they get it. It's all business. They're not playing games. They're, it's pretty straightforward recruitment. When they recruit, unless something happens, a coaching change or whatnot, they're done. A week later, when he committed, or 2 weeks later, Jelani was in Auburn. So he literally commits and then turns around and goes to Auburn for their Big Cat Weekend, which was their biggest recruiting weekend of the year. And I think he visited Auburn. As you said, his sister was there, a student. So like that was part of it, but not really. I think he was up there like double-digit times from the time he committed to Ohio State until he signed with Ohio State. So, especially after losing Ty Lockwood, they were really holding their breath with that one because he was their only tight end signed. Maybe they would have went to someone like Jackson McGohan from Miamisburg or someone like that had Jelani left, but he didn't. He stuck with it. I was with him down at the U.S. Army Bowl in Frisco, Texas in the middle of December. And that was before he signed. He was rock solid. There was not a doubt in his mind. So I think he just had a little fun with the process. I do think he seriously looked at Auburn. Honestly, that's one where the coaching change happening when it did probably helped, because had the new staff been in place even a month before they were, I don't know, maybe Jelani Thurman would have signed with Auburn. So good get for Ohio State, super athletic kid, crazy high potential. Let's see if they can figure out how to use him.
Well, you mentioned the other guy who was committed in that cycle, Ty Lockwood. That's a whole another really interesting story that you can find in Alex's column on the Huddle board at BuckeyeHuddle.com. But Ty Lockwood ended up, I'm going to spoil the surprise here, you probably know this already, but Ty Lockwood ended up at Alabama. And so did the last guy I wanted to talk to Alex about, because the guys Ohio State signed on the offensive line, 3 in-state guys plus Miles Walker, not a ton of drama with any of those, but there were some really interesting stories about some of the other guys that they were in on, and they, were names that we kept talking about and names we kept hearing about, and then who ended up other places. And one of them was Ola Salinen, just like Ty Lockwood. He ended up at Alabama. But Alex, what was the story of Ola Salinen not ending up at Ohio State and going to play for Nick Saban instead?
Yeah, this is one also where I think NIL played a huge role. And again, I'm not making excuses for Ohio State or saying anyone did anything wrong, the kids, the school, whatever, but it's just a fact of the matter. Ohio State lost multiple recruitments in the cycle on big-time kids due to, NIL situations of different sorts and kinds. And, Olas, I think, if it was just truly a pure decision, no NIL, everything I know, I think Ohio State would have been tough to beat. I think Alabama was right there the whole way, even without NIL, but I do think that Ohio State might have had a little bit of an edge. But I do think NIL was a big factor in this, and at one point, that's why I think a lot of people thought he was going to Miami. I think Alabama, with everything they can offer, plus, whatever they put in front of him from an NIL perspective, I think kind of tilted the scales in the last minute. From what I've heard, there might have been some ties to a guy named Michael Caspino, who's a lawyer he's the guy who famously navigated the Nico Imaleva deal with Tennessee and has had his hand in kind of constructing some NIL deals for a number of different prospects. I do think that there was some maybe involvement with him, with Olas. And again, there's nothing wrong with that. That's totally allowed within the rules as long as, you weren't given something up front to come to a school. It's not supposed to be used for recruitment. It's supposed to be used once you're there, but kind of putting in the framework of what his NIL package could look like once he gets to school. And yeah, I just don't think there was anything Ohio State could have did. I think Fry had a great relationship with him. I think he felt comfortable at Ohio State, but whatever Ohio State was able to, the best guarantees they were able to give him as far as like projections and numbers and showing what other talented offensive linemen on their team, like Paris Johnson or Luke Whippler, et cetera, were making. I guess that couldn't compare with whatever some of the others were. And then, look, Alabama's Alabama, so you can't really fault the kid for picking Alabama.
Yeah, you can't, Ohio State can sell, playing in big games and playing for championships and NFL development, and Alabama can kind of go, and also here. There are not very many teams that can go kind of head-to-head, toe-to-toe with Ohio State in terms of some of those types of metrics. But yeah, Alabama, Georgia, those are kind where you kind of go, yeah, I can kind of see that. So, well, that is just, we are just barely scratching the surface on the Alex's deep dive on the behind-the-scenes stories on the offensive side of the ball. He posted that on the Huddle board about a week ago now. Let you guys have a little time to marinate on that, read that before we did this show. So you can find all the rest of those. Got to sign up to become a member today at BuckeyeHuddle.com to get the rest of those stories. And then the defensive side of the ball, that's going to be coming probably in the next week or so. It takes a little while for Alex to put all this stuff together. There's a lot of information in there. So you can find that when it comes out also on the Huddle board at BuckeyeHuddle.com. Again, you have to be a member, so sign up today there to become a member there. And then also make sure you're checking out all of our podcasts. You can just search Buckeye Huddle wherever you're listening to this. You can find all of our other great shows. Big Me Kickoff, Buckeye Weekly, you know all the drill. You know all those shows. You can find them all. And then also at youtube.com/Buckeye Huddle. Lots of great free content there as well. Again, just sort of scratching the surface of what we offer for our members, but lots of content there as well. So that will do it for today. Thank you guys all for joining us. Have a great day. We'll talk to you tomorrow.